main information that you need to understand people's parasite presentations. So I'm going to go a little bit faster than I have been, and be using 2 slide sets, not 1. But this is pretty interesting stuff, so it's a fun topic. Lectures, Callan. There we go. So I'm opening up the first set of slides about the eukaryotic parasites. So these organisms that you guys are going to present on Tuesday fall into 2 different groups. Most of you have some kind of parasite that is actually eukaryotic, like our cells are eukaryotic. And those can include fungi. So I think we will have 1 presentation on a fungus. Those can include parasitic worms called helminths. I think we have 1 worm presentation. There are several presentations that are on protozoans, which are eukaryotic cells that basically swim around in fluids. Protozoans. And I think out of the 8 presentations, 6 of them fall into these groups. So 1 fungus, 1 helminth, 4 protozoans, and then I think 2 of your groups are presenting on an infection that is with bacteria, but those bacteria are transmitted by ticks. So those of you presenting about the Lyme disease organism and the one that's Rocky Mountain spotted fever, your organisms are actually bacteria, and it's a tick that's giving it to people. The other presentations are about eukaryotic parasites. So these are going to be acting very different from bacteria or viruses. There we go. And so we need to talk about some of those major differences. But these are going to be our 3 big groups of eukaryotic parasites. And we're going to learn some basics about how they act and how they're transmitted to people. Algae are also eukaryotic, but they don't infect people. We don't really have to worry about catching an algae infection. One major big difference with eukaryotic parasites as compared to the prokaryotes or the viruses is that eukaryotes are cells that are very similar to our cells. We are eukaryotes. We have a nucleus, and we have a lot of these cellular organelles. So if a eukaryote infects us, it has a lot of the same machinery as humans do. So I would summarize that by saying that humans share a lot of cellular characteristics with the eukaryotic parasites. And that's just a fact, but the reason why this is inconvenient is that if we're trying to fight or cure or heal or treat eukaryotic parasites, we have a lot of targets in common. For example, if we try to make a drug that blocks eukaryotic ribosomes, that would be great to destroy a eukaryotic parasite, but we have those same kind of ribosomes. So that kind of drug would give us bad side effects. Or if we're going to block a drug, or sorry, if we're going to make a drug that affects a eukaryotic flagellum, it would also affect sperm movement because those have a flagellum and they work basically the same way. So eukaryotic parasites can be harder to treat. Or let's say these can be harder to successfully treat with drugs because there aren't that many drugs that would target them and leave us alone. Eukaryotic infections can be a little bit more challenging medically to cure and to get rid of than a bacterial infection or maybe a virus infection. So on this slide, it's showing you like what are all the parts of a eukaryotic cell? What are the eukaryotic structures that we care about? And some of these would also be shared by bacteria, but some are not. There's a question up there, which of these are similar to prokaryotic components? I want to skip past that for sake of time this year. Both eukaryotes and prokaryotes have flagella to swim with, but they have a really different structure. This is what a eukaryotic flagellum looks like if you do a cross section of it. So instead of focusing on that, I want to describe what are the major differences between a bacterial flagellum and a eukaryotic one. Okay. So both of these cells could swim with a flagellum. But the way that their flagella work are really different. The bacteria flagellum rotates like a outboard motor on a boat, spins on this axis. A eukaryotic flagellum waves like a fishtail. So they have really different motions, and they also have really different components. Both of them are providing movement, but they're having different ways of doing that. So these two are quite different, even though they're providing the same basic function. Another thing that can be shared between eukaryotes and prokaryotes can be cell wall. So if we think about all the different kinds of cells that exist in the world that have cell walls, bacteria do, and plants do, and fungi do. What their cell walls are made out of is really different, though. So what's the major chemical in a bacterial cell wall? It can be in thick or thin versions. Peptidoglycan. What's a plant cell wall made out of? But you haven't thought about this in a while. Cellulose. And fungi have a completely different chemical in their cell wall called chitin. So this structure, chitin is the major strengthener of a fungal cell wall. And then for the animal cells, we don't have a cell wall. So that's a big divider of the different forms of life. Animals don't have a cell wall. Fungus does and bacterium does, but they're made out of different chemicals. Another structure that's kind of shared between different types of cells is that all cells have some kind of ribosome. All cells have ribosomes to help them make proteins. But they occur in two different styles. And this slide is showing you what is a prokaryotic ribosome made out of. So this side goes with prokaryotic. This side goes with eukaryotic. And you can kind of see there that they have similar shapes and they both have protein, some big chunks of protein that help make them up. And they both have ribosomal RNAs that help build their structures. But they are a little bit different in shape. So every cell has a ribosome, but the eukaryotic versus prokaryotic ones have slightly different shapes. And because they have different shapes, that's helpful because we can develop drugs that specifically target prokaryotic ribosomes. So after, might be before Thanksgiving, we start talking about drugs and drug actions. And we have a lot of good antibacterial drugs that take advantage of this little shape difference on a ribosome between their ribosomes and ours. And those drugs, oh my gosh, that could have gone so bad. Those drugs would mess up the bacterial ribosomes and kill them since they can't make proteins, but leave our ribosomes alone. We don't have enough differences between human ribosomes and worm ribosomes to make a drug that would only affect worm ribosomes. But the bacterial ones, that's a good target for drug design to kill bacteria, but not eukaryotes. That's going to come back up when we get to drug design. Here's a silly question. What's the craziest weird thing that ever happened to a professor during a class? Like if I had just fell down right there. You ever had somebody have like a sudden extreme problem during class?
That'd probably been like number one.
If I had fallen there. I know Dr. Vaughn taught in here one time and there was water pouring out of that corner in Bio 1. You ever had anybody get a nosebleed or anything during class? Or get sick and have to leave?
Teacher, whenever I was in my fourth grade, got sick, she had to leave for like 2 hours. I couldn't get a sub in, so like it was like one teacher got going back and forth. Just both of us.
It'd be rough. One day I put on a pair of shoes that I had saved for a long time. I didn't realize the soles were dry rotting, and I was in this class, and I didn't know it, but every time I walked back and forth, there were pieces of my shoes coming off. And by the time the class was over, there's this little pile of rubber all up here, and I was so mad because I had saved those shoes for a few years. Silly. Okay, so what we're going to go through next is for each of the big classes of the eukaryotic parasites, what's kind of special about them, and how do they tend to infect people. So we're going to start with fungus. So if you're Histoplasma capsulatum group, this relates to your organism. Fungi kind of are going to exist in two different body plans, the ones that affect people. So fungi have cell walls, and a lot of their growth is going to be what we call hyphal or hyphae. And you may have learned about this before, but these are thread-like body structures. And when you look at fungus growing on bread or a strawberry or something like that, those thready parts that are growing down into the surface, those are the hyphae. And generally, the fungi are going to use some kind of carbohydrate from their host to power themselves. So a mushroom growing on a log, it's using the cellulose in that tree trunk to give itself carbon. If it's out in nature like that, we say it's a decomposer. But there are certain fungus that can use our body sugars and our body structures as their carbohydrate source. And they might be growing in these thread-like structures called hyphae. Fungi reproduce by spores. And these are fungal spores, not endospores. And the spores will tend to be coming off of a fruiting body of that fungus. And where do these go once they come off? Where you tend to find fungal spores in the world. I just breathed them in. So these are going to go in the air. And they're going to be airborne, and they might fall on the ground and fall on surfaces, but spores of fungi tend to disperse through the air. And I'll get your question right after I write this. Yeah.
So this one is for that.
Yeah, this kind of goes with this picture.
Okay.
So this is showing you that when a fungus reproduces, it's making all these spores, and they're going to kind of release into the air, and then they'll drift around and land somewhere, or we might breathe them in. So the fungi that are very damaging to people, we tend to breathe in their spores, and then they start forming a new fungal colony in the lungs, is one way that we get those. So here's a picture of a fungal life cycle if it's growing on a strawberry, which tends to happen. You hate it when you buy strawberries, like, they look great today, I'm going to eat them tomorrow, and then the next day you have to throw out half of them. So we're going to start with a spore. A spore lands somewhere, and if it's a good environment, it's going to start growing and then initiating hyphae growth, which then are going to spread throughout this organism, and they're going to take up carbohydrate. So the more the fungus grows, it's feeding on the strawberry carbohydrates to build its body. And then it keeps growing, and then it will form these fruiting structures, which then release more spores. Something important about fungus is that there are not that many fungi that actually infect people. There are some, but of all the fungi in the world, the vast majority of them don't infect people. Of the ones that do infect people, most of those cause surface infections. There's only very few that infect internal tissues of the body. So most people, if they have a fungal infection, it's going to be on their skin or their hair or possibly in their mouth or their toenail or something like that. They tend to be disgusting looking, but they're not going to kill the person. We just notice them because they're on the outside of the body. So you can have a fungal infection of your hair. That's gross. So what you're seeing here, this is hair from somebody's head, and this is a fungus with hyphae that is using hair carbohydrate as its fuel source.
How would you get rid of that? Just like shave your head?
That's what I would cut my hair first,
Yeah.
because my hair is like that.
Like there's not like a medicine.
You can take, I mean, for hair infection, you really just need to cut it off. Yeah. Skin infection. So here's like athlete's foot. That's a fungal infection. This poor child has a really bad fungal infection that has gone untreated. Like you don't go to this level overnight. Someone is not taking care of him. Which is sad, but, and then this person has a fungal infection in their mouth. That particular one, if you've got fungal infection in the mouth, that's usually yeast. Yeast is a fungus. And fungal infection of the mouth is called thrush, like the songbird. I don't know why it's called that, but thrush is a fungal infection of the inside of the mouth. And there are different reasons why people could have that. Like, look how good their teeth look. They have really good dental care, but they've also got a fungal infection in their mouth. And probably, it's really common for people to have some minor fungal infection on their skin at some point. Most of the human fungal infections are going to be superficial. So what I called here surface infection. The better term for that is it's superficial. Sometimes we say if people only care about their outer appearance, they're superficial. It is kind of a problem. It's not going to kill you. It's just kind of cosmetic and uncomfortable. You've got some examples here of different organisms that can cause those. I mostly just want to point out that if it's your outer skin, your hair, dermis, skin, nails, and so on, those are superficial. They need treatment, but nobody dies from these. You still should get it treated. The ones that infect internal tissues, we would call those a systemic infection. Systemic fungal infection. And because we tend to get those by breathing in the spores, the lungs are where, if you get a bad fungal infection that is very damaging or life-threatening, tends to be a lung infection. So in those cases, you get the spores in the lungs, and then it's all nice and warm and damp. And they'll germinate, and they start to form fungal colonies in the lungs. There aren't that many of those, fortunately. Something else that I want you to know about fungi, I'm going to skip over this for this year. Yeah. Cross this one out, yeah. And go to this one. This is kind of showing that you can have these superficial infections just on the top layer, getting down into the cutaneous layer, which involves the dermis, So this would be epidermal only. This would be infecting the dermis. And then if it gets deeper than that, it's subcutaneous. Like under skin, subcutaneous. The longer you let these go untreated, the deeper they're going to get. So they might start out being only epidermal. If you just let that linger, it will become subcutaneous and get a little bit more serious. The deeper that a fungal infection goes, deeper infections are harder to treat, and those will require drug treatment, even if it just started out on the surface of your skin. People that have nail fungus, if that's been persisting for a while, you can try putting the ointments on the top of it, but you will need drug treatment to really get to the bottom of it and to really clear that up. Same for any of the advanced, been there a long time fungal infections. Like this boy, he needs some creams and ointments, but he also needs pills at this point. And then the other thing that I want you to know about fungal infections is how you recognize the name of one. So they tend to have certain root words in their names. They will tend to have phyte or phyto. Let's see, that one would be the beginning of the word. So if you see an organism's name in Latin and it has as part of it something phyte or a phyto something, or within it somewhere in the word spore, like a fungal spore, that's a fungus. So I would like you to know that these are fungal related words, fungal related root words, instead of trying to teach you all the top 10 specific fungi that infect people. And the rest of the word will kind of tell you what it is. So epidermophyton, that's a fungus that infects the skin. Or trichophyton has the ability to infect your hair. The other thing to circle on this is to circle the word ringworm. Everybody's heard of ringworm. It's not a worm. It's a fungus. And the word ringworm comes from before people actually knew what was causing that. So ringworm is going to have an appearance on the outside of the body. It's not from a worm, it's from a fungus. So that's kind of the basics that I want you to know about fungal infections. Oh, that's the last slide. What's going wrong here? Okay. So I'm going to switch slide sets now. And kind of have a similar overview of the worm infections and the protozoan infections. So several of your groups, you're presenting about a protozoan on Tuesday. And protozoans are one of those groups of organisms where if it like kind of not obviously something else, it goes into this category of protozoans. So all protozoans are eukaryotes. And they have in common that they can move through liquids. They have no cell wall. And they generally are going to live most of the time in some kind of aquatic environment. Moving through the water or moving through the liquid is an important part of their lifestyle, let's say. This would include amoebas. But it might also include some eukaryotic cells that swim with flagella. So they kind of have different ways that they can move. So they're categorized by how do they move. They might crawl, or they might move with cilia, or they might move with flagella. And that kind of gives the big categories. So if they crawl through a liquid, they're an amoeba. If they flap themselves around like a paramecium, that's a way that they can move through liquid. If they swim with a flagella, they're in a certain category. And this group just kind of floats around more. So when I ask you for the category of the organism for presentations, just protozoan is okay. But they have a lot of diversity in how they look and how they get around. Protozoans tend to have kind of two alternate forms in which they can exist. So the form where they're kind of propelling themselves and eating and doing their normal lifestyle, that's called trophozoite. Trophozoite. So that comes from tropho for eat, and zoite is like animal. So it's like a little animal-ish stage where it actually will look for food and swim around or crawl around. They will also, a lot of times, have a part of their life cycle where they are in a cyst form. A cyst form. So the cysts, they're going to have different numbers of cells within them, but they're generally going to be spherical. They're spherical and they are more resistant to bad conditions. So they're not an endospore, but it's kind of a similar concept. Like you have a cell that does all the normal stuff, that's trophozoite. And you have a version that is kind of hunkered down and it's a little bit more resistant and it can travel or it can persist in the soil or water or whatever. That's the cyst form. When we're checking people for protozoan infections, we tend to examine stool samples to find the cysts because they're easy to spot. So maybe you never think about what feces would look like under the microscope. Well, thinking very hard about that. What feces would look like under the microscope. But when you're looking through a lot of stuff under the microscope and you suddenly see a perfect circle in feces, that's probably a protozoan cyst. And so where I used to teach, where I started teaching A&P, that lead teacher wanted all the students to be able to recognize protozoan cysts under the microscope. And then when I got here, I'm like, what do you do? That's not going to be part of your job. You're just going to hand patients a cup, like, we need a stool sample. And then you take it to the lab, and somebody trained will look for perfect circle cysts in the feces, because that's a lot easier to find than a trophozoite cell here and there. So some of you, when you're presenting, you'll be describing that people ingest the cysts and so on. This is showing kind of how they go between the two cycles. I'm not going to spend any time there. I'm going to go here. A lot of people, the way that they contract a protozoan infection is that they, in some way, are ingesting, drinking or eating cysts. It's not always the case, but a lot of times. And the cysts are tough enough that they can actually make it through the stomach acidity and not get killed. So they will kind of stay in the cyst form, go through all that acid. They survive the digestive enzymes, and then they get down into the intestines, which is like Dollywood for them, like some like woohoo, fun, good times. Now there's lots of nutrients, it's warm, it's wet, and then they will turn back into the trophozoite form, and they have a good old time in there swimming around and stealing our nutrition. And they would fall into the class of what we call intestinal parasites. So the trophozoites are living in here and having fun party time. As your food residues start moving through the large intestine, like that's a little bit less good conditions by the time you have feces released from the body. So when people release feces, it will have cysts and trophozoites, but the cysts are what tends to be long-lived and infected. So you eat the cyst, goes through the body, tend to get intestinal infections from these protozoan infections. Not every protozoan causes intestinal problems, but most of them do that harm people. Once in a while, we will have a vector, and we haven't talked about that word yet, but it's really important. Some kind of other animal that's not a protozoan, but it's super involved in passing you the protozoan, and we would call that a vector. So this is a definition that we need to know. So we could say that a vector, this word vector, it's an animal that is passing an infectious microbe to a person. It's not that this animal is literally causing us the disease, but it's passing us a disease-causing organism. And a lot of times the microbe is kind of depending on the vector as part of its transmission. So for example, we can't get malaria without a mosquito giving us the protozoan that causes malaria.
So would that make this zoonotic?
Yeah, all vector vector transmitted diseases would also be zoonotic. Yeah. So if your organism, your parasite is one that's passed to people by the tick is the vector. Or one of you all have cats are important to your story. Some of you, there's birds that are involved in passing this organism to people. All of those big animals would be the vectors. And they're involved in giving us the disease, but the actual problem is the little protozoan, or sometimes it's a bacterium that's actually infecting us. So if your disease has a vector that's important, you should be talking about that Tuesday. Cat group that's related to cats. Do you know it yet? There's one presentation that's cats are important in passing the disease. Mosquitoes are a really common vector. Ticks are a common vector. Those are probably the top two. Okay, great. One more thing before we get to helminths. The protozoans that we catch by cysts tend to not have vectors. Like we don't need a vector to give us a cyst. We're going to drink it or eat it by accident when we're drinking or eating things. But some protozoans are very dependent on this bigger animal vector to pass them from person to person.
They pass through like different animals, they pass those other animals.
Sometimes they do, and sometimes they don't. And that's interesting because, like, the cats don't really get sick from this thing that they're passing to us, and the mosquitoes don't get sick from the parasites that are in them and then pass to us. So it's usually no, but sometimes yes. Any of you from armadillo country? They can harbor disease. Are they?
Yeah.
They're making their way there. So now we come to helminths, which are parasitic worms. And this is, to me, this is the most disgusting thing in microbiology. I think because I've seen them. Like when you can see them with your naked eye, it's just so real. Helminths are parasitic worms, and they can exist in 3 different forms. 3 different body plans, which are actually pretty different from each other. So their 3 body plans include flatworm, and these would be examples of flatworm. So, like if you threw a piece of slime down on the desk and it's splatted and it's spread out and it's kind of flat and thin and spread out, that would be like a flatworm. Those can be called also flukes. Not like an accident, but that's also a word that means a certain type of worm. They can be segmented like a tapeworm. So this particular type of worms has all of these different body segments, and it can actually break into parts, and each one of these has eggs in it, which is just gross. So tapeworms would be an example. So you don't even have to get the whole tapeworm inside you. You could just get one segment, and then it's got eggs that would hatch inside you. And then there is a version called roundworms. And these would include the group called nematodes. Ascaris, that group of you that's working on Ascaris lumbricoides, it's a roundworm. And these are, what I would think of as your standard worm. It's kind of the same diameter all the way through. Worms, all the different parasitic worms that infect people have kind of the same goal. They tend to act in this way. They want to get into the lower GI tract, live there, and use our nutrients. That would be, like the Garden of Eden for a parasitic worm is to be in the human small intestine. And all of those good absorbable units that we talk about need to. You don't even have to find food, it just comes to them. It just comes to them. So that'd be great if you're a worm. It's awful if you're a person. Parasitic worms, we don't tend to think about them as much in this country, but worldwide, parasitic worms are a huge problem for human general health and especially kids' health. So the worst thing about parasitic worms is that in kids, if they have bad infections, that can stunt the kids' growth. And their learning. So some places around the world where kids have pretty bad worm infections, they can't grow well. They don't have enough glucose available to their brain to think well. And it's not just a health problem, it's a societal problem and a progress of your whole nation problem to have these worm infections. There are kind of two major ways that people get parasitic worm infections. This chart has a lot of info on it. It's not my favorite, but it's listing some type of useful info about types of worm infections. So two major ways that people can get worm infections is that they either ingest the worms or the eggs from fecal oral transmission. And this is pretty common with little kids because they're always putting stuff in their mouth. For my kids, like hardly ever washing their hands, even during COVID. Like the youngest one will like come over and give me something, and you can just feel it. Like he hasn't washed his hands since like yesterday. So if you get fecal material on your hands, it doesn't have to be a whole lot. It could have worm eggs in it. Get in their mouth, travel down to the GI tract, and it's Garden of Eden there for the worms. And then the worms would be growing in the child's intestines. And when they defecate, out come more worms and more worm eggs. In some cases, the worms will make the child itchy, and then they'll scratch their butt more than kids even do. And then they get, more, they self-infect or they go play together with another kid. That's one way, and that's really common. Really common. The other way is to ingest worms via uncooked mussel. Like you're catching a worm infection through meat. So this could be meat, fish, snails. Those are the major ones. Look, I'm leaving one out. It's meat includes a lot. There is also the possibility sometimes that worms can crawl up through your skin. That's pretty rare. I was really worried about that when I was a kid, because I heard that could happen. I have worm phobia. It can happen. It's pretty rare. So I'm not going to go through that one. Is that the last slide? I'm going to end by telling you my favorite worm story and how I got phobic about worms. So when I was a little kid, I was at my Nana and Papa's in the summer,